Imagine standing in a graveyard that never ends, row after row of white crosses, millions of names. We are told these people died to save the world. We are told their sacrifice bought us peace. But what if that peace was a total lie? What if the men who ended the Great War actually wrote the script for a much bloodier sequel? Today we are tearing up the history books. We are going to look at a dark truth that most teachers are too afraid to touch. I am going to prove to you that the heroes of the First War accidentally became the architects of the Second. But wait, before we dive into the fire, look at the world in 1918. People are dancing in the streets. They are crying tears of joy. They truly think the nightmare is over. They think they have fixed the world. But look closer. Beneath the parties, the ground is already cracking. The leaders of the world are meeting in a giant gold palace called Versailles. But they aren't there to heal. They are there for one thing: revenge. They were angry. They were exhausted. And they were about to make a mistake that would haunt the planet for 100 years. Think about that. Think about a puzzle where you force the pieces together even when they don't fit. That was the new Europe. New countries were born overnight. But the people inside them, they hated each other. This wasn't a plan for peace. It was a recipe for a massive explosion. The world didn't just fall into World War II 20 years later. No, it was pushed, and the people doing the pushing were the ones wearing the medals of victory. Now I want to give you a reason to stay with me for this entire journey. History isn't just about the past, it's a mirror. At the very end of this video, I am going to show you 3 specific warning signs from 1919 that are happening in our world right now. If you know what they are, you will see the news in a completely different way. You will see the hidden clock that is ticking toward the next big conflict. You need to see this. Stay with me, because the final lesson is the one that matters most. Listen closely. If you want to understand why millions of people marched into battle in 1939, you have to look at a single piece of paper signed in 19... It is called the Treaty of Versailles. On the outside, it looked like a peace treaty. But on the inside, it was a suicide note for the modern world. Imagine you are in a schoolyard. There is a massive fight. Everyone is bruised. Everyone is bleeding. Finally, the teachers come and break it up. But instead of helping everyone heal, the teachers pick one kid, just one. They point their fingers at him and say, "This entire fight was your fault. You started it. You broke the windows. You hurt the others. And now you are going to pay for every single thing that happened, even the things you didn't do." That kid was Germany. And the teachers, those were the Allied leaders, Britain, France, and America. They sat in a room filled with gold and mirrors and decided the fate of millions of people who weren't even allowed to speak. They forced Germany to sign something called Article 231. We call it the War Guilt Clause. Think about that name for a second. War, guilt. The Allies didn't just want Germany's money. They wanted their dignity. They forced an entire nation to admit in writing that they were the only bad guys in the world. Imagine being a German soldier, coming home from a war where your friends died. You are hungry, you are tired, you lost everything. And then you read that your government just signed a paper saying it was all your fault. How would you feel? Would you feel like being peaceful? Or would you feel a fire starting to burn in your chest? That fire is what Hitler eventually used to burn down the world. But the Allies didn't stop at guilt. They wanted a pound of flesh. They looked at Germany and said, "You owe us money." A lot of money. How much? Well, in today's money, it was billions and billions of dollars. It was an amount so high that Germany couldn't possibly pay it back. It would be like telling a middle school student they have to pay back $1 trillion by next week. It is impossible. It is a trap. Why did the Allies do this? Well, France was scared. They had been invaded twice by Germany in 50 years. They didn't want peace. They wanted a Germany that was so poor and so weak that it could never stand up again. They wanted to break Germany's legs so it could never walk. But here is the thing about history. When you try to crush a people completely, you don't make them weak, you make them desperate. And desperate people do dangerous things. Let's look at the map. This is where the story gets really messy. The leaders at Versailles started drawing lines on the map of Europe like they were playing a game. They took pieces of Germany and gave them to other countries. They created new countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia. Now that sounds good, right? Everyone should have their own country. But there was a massive problem. Inside these new countries, they trapped millions of Germans. Suddenly, people who had lived in Germany their whole lives were told, "You aren't German anymore. You belong to this new country now." Their schools were changed. Their language was banned in some places. They felt like strangers in their own homes. Imagine if someone drew a line around your house and told you that you were now part of a country that hated you. You would be angry. You would wait for anyone to come and save you. This gave future dictators a perfect excuse. They could point at the map and say, "Look, our brothers and sisters are being bullied by these new countries. We must go to war to bring them home." The Allies thought they were building a wall to keep Germany in. Instead, they built a pressure cooker. They closed all the valves. They turned up the heat. And then they walked away and acted surprised when the whole thing exploded 20 years later. Let's talk about the soldiers. In 1918, millions of men walked away from the trenches. They were called the Lost Generation. Their minds were broken by the sounds of falling bombs. They came home to a country that was humiliated. In Germany, the army didn't feel like they had lost on the battlefield. They felt like they had been stabbed in the back by the politicians who signed that treaty. This is a very important phrase, the stab in the back. It wasn't true, but people believed it because it felt better than the truth. It was a lie that acted like a poison. It made people hate their own government. It made them look for a strong man who would tear up the treaty and make them feel proud again. While this was happening, the Allies were having a party. In London and Paris, they thought they had won forever. They started taking apart their own armies. They wanted to forget the war ever happened. This is a huge mistake. If you are going to treat someone like an enemy, you have to stay strong. But the Allies were mean to Germany, and then they became weak. They gave Germany every reason to hate them, and then they stopped watching the door. It was the perfect storm. Think about the logic here. If you take away a person's job, their money, their pride, and their land, what do they have left? They have nothing to lose. A person with nothing to lose is the most dangerous person on earth. The Treaty of Versailles created an entire nation of people with nothing to lose. It wasn't just a document. It was a factory that manufactured anger. Every time a German child went hungry because the economy was failing, they blamed the treaty. Every time a German worker saw their factory close, they blamed the Allies. The Treaty of Versailles became the big bad wolf of German life. It was the reason for every problem. So when a man with a tiny moustache stood on a wooden crate in a beer hall and started screaming that the treaty was a crime, people didn't think he was crazy. They thought he was the only one telling the truth. We often ask, how could the world let someone like Hitler rise to power? The answer is right here, in Phase 1. The world didn't just let him rise. The world built the ladder for him. They built the ladder out of the pages of the Treaty of Versailles. They handed him the microphone by making the German people feel like they were under attack by the rest of the world. So when you see the tanks crossing the border in 1939, don't just see a new war. See the old war finishing what it started. See the ink of 1919 turning into the blood of 1939. The Peace of Versailles was never really peace. It was just a 20-year break to let a new generation of children grow up large enough to carry a rifle. The leaders in that gold palace thought they were being smart. They thought they were being tough. But in reality, they were just lighting a fuse, a very, very long fuse. And for 20 years that fuse burned quietly through the streets of Berlin, through the banks of New York, and through the hearts of every person who felt cheated by the Great War. If the Treaty of Versailles was the wound, then the economy was the infection that turned everything rotten. You might think that history is just about kings, generals, and maps. But most of the time, history is actually about the stomach. It's about whether or not people can eat. In the 20 years between the two world wars, the global economy didn't just stumble, it fell off a cliff. And when people are starving, they stop caring about democracy. They stop caring about peace. They start looking for a savior, no matter how scary that savior might be. Imagine you have been saving your money in a piggy bank for 10 years. You have enough to buy a brand new car. You go to sleep, and when you wake up, that same pile of money can't even buy you a piece of gum. That is what happened to Germany in 1923. It's called hyperinflation. Why did it happen? Remember those billions of dollars Germany owed the Allies? Well, Germany didn't have the money. They were broke. Their factories were struggling, and their people were tired. But the Allies, especially France, didn't care. They wanted their payment. So France did something bold. They sent their army into Germany's factory zone, a place called the Ruhr, and they basically said, if you won't pay us in cash, we will take your coal and your steel by force. The German workers were furious. They didn't fight back with guns. They fought back by going on strike. They refused to work for the French. But those workers still needed to eat. So the German government did the dumbest thing a government can do. They started printing money to pay the strikers. Money is only valuable if there is something backing it up. If you just print paper, the paper becomes worthless. And boy, did it become worthless. Prices started rising every hour. People would get paid their salary at noon, and they would have to literally run to the grocery store because by 4 p.m. the price of milk would have doubled. There are photos from this time that look like they are from a fantasy movie. Children playing with blocks made of stacks of money. People carrying millions of marks in wheelbarrows just to buy a loaf of bread. A woman once left a basket full of money outside a shop. When she came back, the money was still there, but someone had stolen the basket. The basket was worth more than the cash inside it. This wasn't just a bad economy. This was the death of the middle class. Think about the teachers, the doctors, and the shopkeepers who had worked hard and saved for their retirement. In 1 month, their entire life's work was deleted. They felt cheated. They felt like the system was a joke. And who did they blame? They blamed the democracy that the Allies had forced them to create. They started thinking, if this is what freedom looks like, maybe we don't want it. Just when it looked like Germany was going to collapse completely, a hero stepped in from across the ocean, the United States. In 1924, an American banker named Charles Dawes came up with a plan. It was called the Dawes Plan, and it was a giant spinning circle of debt. Here is how it worked. America would lend money to Germany. Germany would use that money to build its factories and pay reparations to Britain and France. Then Britain and France would use that same money to pay back the war debts they owed to America from World War I. Do you see the problem? It's a loop. It's a house of cards. For a few years it actually worked. From 1924 to 1929, life in Germany got better. They called these the Golden Twenties. People were going to movies, listening to jazz, and buying new clothes. It looked like the ticking bomb we talked about in the intro had been diffused. But it was a lie. The whole world's peace was built on American loans. The entire global economy was tied to the New York Stock Exchange. Everyone was standing on a tightrope, and America was the one holding the rope. In October 1929, the rope snapped. The US stock market crashed. Suddenly, American banks didn't have money to lend to Germany anymore. In fact, they did the opposite. They asked for their money back immediately. This was the Great Depression. It hit the world like a tidal wave. But while America and Britain were hurt, Germany was destroyed. Since they were already weak from the First War, the Depression didn't just take their jobs, it took their hope. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed. That is 1 out of every 3 workers. Imagine walking down your street and seeing that every third house has a family with no income, no food, and no future. These people were desperate. They were cold. They were angry. And that is when the strong men came out of the shadows. You have to understand that in 1930, the Nazi Party was small. Most people thought they were too radical. But as the breadlines got longer, the Nazi message started to sound better. Hitler didn't talk about complex economics. He talked about feelings. He told the people, you aren't poor because you're lazy. You're poor because the Allies stole your money at Versailles. You're poor because the international bankers are out to get you. You're poor because the government is weak. He promised work and bread. That was his slogan. Work and bread. To a man who hasn't fed his children in 3 days, that sounds like the most beautiful sentence in the world. The Depression was the economic virus that allowed the Nazi ideology to spread. Without the crash of 1929, Hitler probably would have remained a nobody, a footnote in a history book. But the economic collapse gave him a stage. It wasn't just Germany, either. All over the world, the Depression made people turn away from democracy. In Japan, the military started taking over because the silk trade had collapsed and people were starving. In Italy, Mussolini promised to bring back the glory of Rome to fix the broken economy. The Great War had weakened the world's immune system. The Treaty of Versailles had created the infection, and the Great Depression was the fever that nearly killed the patient. We often think that people choose their leaders based on big ideas like freedom or equality. But history tells us that people choose their leaders based on who can fill their plates. The Allies thought they could punish Germany financially and still have a peaceful world. They were wrong. You cannot have a stable world if one of the biggest countries in that world is a bankrupt, starving mess. By forcing Germany to pay impossible amounts of money, the Allies didn't get rich. Instead, they bought themselves a Second World War. They traded a few $1 billion in 1920 for 70 million lives in 1939. Think about the irony. To pay for the damage of the First War, the Allies created a situation where the Second War was the only way out for the German people. By 1933, the German economy had started to recover slightly, but the damage to the soul of the country was done. They didn't trust the world anymore. They didn't trust their neighbors. They only trusted the man who promised to rip up the treaties, stop the payments, and make them powerful again. Money is more than just paper. It is the glue that holds society together. In the 1920s and 30s, that glue melted, and when the glue melted, the map of the world fell apart. Now look at the big picture. We have a treaty that made people angry. We have a map that made people hate their neighbors. And now we have an economy that made people desperate. All the ingredients for a global explosion are in the pot. The only thing missing is the spark. But before we get to the spark, we have to look at the people who were supposed to keep the peace, the police of the world. Why didn't they stop this? Why did they let the virus spread for 20 years? That is the biggest mystery of all. The world saw the storm coming. They watched the clouds get darker every year. They heard the thunder. And yet they did nothing. They sat in their offices in London, Paris, and Washington, and they hoped that if they ignored the monster, it would go away. But monsters don't go away. They grow. Especially when you feed them. Now we have to look away from Germany for a moment. Most people think World War II happened because Germany got bad, and everyone else had to go stop them. But that is a fairy tale. The truth is much darker. The truth is that the Great War left almost everyone feeling like they had been robbed. Even the people who won the war felt like they had lost. Think about that. Imagine you and your friends go to a store to buy a pizza. You all chip in your money. You all wait in line. But when the pizza comes out, the two biggest guys in the group, Britain and France, grab almost every slice. They look at you and say, "Thanks for the help, but we're the bosses here." That is exactly how Italy and Japan felt in 1919. And that feeling of being cheated is what turned them from allies into deadly enemies. Let's start with Italy. In World War I, Italy was on the side of the good guys. They lost 500,000 men fighting in the frozen mountains. They were promised land. They were promised respect. But when they got to the peace meetings at Versailles, the big three, America, Britain and France, basically ignored them. The Italian Prime Minister actually walked out of the meeting crying. He felt humiliated. Back in Italy, people started calling it the mutilated victory. They felt like they had bled for nothing. Now remember what we said about strong men. When a country feels humiliated, they look for someone who can make them feel big again. In Italy, that man was Benito Mussolini. He was the original dictator of this era. He didn't wait for Hitler. He actually gave Hitler the idea. Mussolini told the Italians, "The world treats you like a second-class citizen. But I will make you Romans again. I will take what is ours by force." Because of the Great War's messy ending, Italy, a country that should have been a partner in keeping the peace, became the first country to start breaking it. They realized that the rules of the New World only applied to the weak. If you were strong enough to take what you wanted, the Allies were too tired from the First War to stop you. Now, let's look across the ocean to Japan. This is the part of the story most people skip, but it is the most important part if you want to understand the attack on Pearl Harbor. In 1914, Japan was an ally of Britain. They helped fight the Germans in the Pacific. They were an emerging world power. They came to the peace table in 1919 with one simple request. They wanted a racial equality clause put into the League of Nations documents. They just wanted the world to agree that people of all races were equal. Think about that. It sounds like a no-brainer, right? But the Western powers, countries like Australia and the United States, said no. They didn't want to admit that an Asian nation was equal to them. They blocked the clause. Japan took this as a slap in the face. Their leaders realized that no matter how much they acted like Western powers, they would never be accepted into the club. The lesson Japan learned from WWI wasn't peace. The lesson was the West will never respect us unless we are too powerful to be ignored. This moment changed the course of history. Japan stopped trying to work with the world and started trying to conquer it. They saw the British and French owning colonies all over Asia and said, "Why can't we do that? We are the ones who actually live here." The Great War didn't bring Japan into the fold. It pushed them into a corner. And by the 1930s, the Japanese military decided that the only way to survive was to build their own empire, starting with China. While Italy and Japan were getting angry, the rest of the world was trying to build a police force. It was called the League of Nations. This was the big idea of the American president, Woodrow Wilson. He wanted a place where countries could talk about their problems instead of shooting each other. It sounds beautiful, but there was a massive gaping hole in the plan. The United States, the country that came up with the idea, refused to join. Imagine a police station where the strongest officer in town refuses to wear a badge or carry a radio. That was the League. Because America stayed out, the League had no teeth. They could pass resolutions and they could complain, but they couldn't actually stop anyone from doing anything. This is the aha moment for our 2-hour journey. The League of Nations wasn't a wall, it was a curtain. It looked solid, but you could walk right through it. In the 1930s, when Japan invaded China, the League said, "Please stop." Japan said no and walked out of the building. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, the League said, "That's not nice." Mussolini laughed. When Hitler started building tanks, which was illegal under the Treaty of Versailles, the League did nothing. The peace of the 1920s was a ghost. Everyone was pretending the rules mattered, but everyone could see that the people in charge were too scared of another war to actually enforce them. Why were Britain and France so scared? Why were they so weak? To understand that, you have to understand the psychology of the trench. The men who were running Britain and France in the 1930s were the same men who had watched their entire generation get wiped out in the mud of WWI. They weren't cowards, they were traumatized. They had seen what happens when you go to war. They remembered the smell of the gas. They remembered the sound of the machine guns. To these leaders, anything was better than another war. They were so terrified of 1914 happening again that they let 1939 become inevitable. This is called appeasement. It's like seeing a bully on the playground and giving him your lunch money, hoping he'll leave you alone tomorrow. But as we know, bullies don't leave you alone. They just use your lunch money to buy a bigger stick. While the winners were trying to forget the war, a new generation was growing up in the losers' countries. These were children who didn't remember the horrors of the trenches. They only remembered the hunger of the blockade. They only remembered the shame of the treaty. In Germany and Japan, the youth were being taught that war wasn't a tragedy, it was a chance for glory. They were being taught that their parents had been betrayed and that it was their job to fix it. This is the continuous war theory. The people fighting in 1939 weren't different people. They were the children of the people from 1914. The same families, the same names, the same grudges. Think about the map again. The Treaty of Versailles had created fake countries. Places like Czechoslovakia were made of different groups of people who didn't want to be together. It was like a giant glass sculpture held together by Scotch tape. As soon as the sun, the economy got too hot, and the wind the dictators started blowing, the glass shattered. Every single border that Hitler crossed in the 1930s was a border that had been drawn in 1919. He wasn't just conquering, he was correcting the map. Or at least that's what he told the world. And because the world knew the map was unfair, they didn't have the heart to stop him at first. We often look at the 1920s as a time of parties and progress. But if you look closely, you can see the cracks everywhere. In Russia, a violent revolution had created the Soviet Union, a direct result of WWI's collapse. In the Middle East, the British and French had promised land to everyone and given it to no one, creating a century of war. In the US, people were so disgusted by the First War that they pulled their blankets over their heads and ignored the rest of the world. The global fracture wasn't just about Germany, it was a total breakdown of the human family. The Great War had broken the world's trust. Nobody believed in treaties anymore. Nobody believed in fair play. By the time we reach 1935, the world isn't two separate camps. It is a collection of angry, scared and broken nations all waiting for the first person to throw a punch. The long war had never really stopped. It just went underground for a few years. It lived in the hearts of Italian soldiers who felt cheated. It lived in the minds of Japanese officers who felt disrespected. It lived in the memories of French leaders who were too scared to move. The stage is now set. The economy has failed. The leaders are weak. The people are angry. The map is a mess. We have reached the point of no return. The fuse has burned down to the last inch. Now we have to look at the final moments before the explosion. We have to look at how all these different threads, the money, the maps, the anger, all tied together into a knot that only a Second World War could cut. But before we do that, think about the warning signs I mentioned in the beginning. Can you see them yet? Can you see the economic virus in our world today? Can you see the broken maps and the weak police? Hold on to that thought, because as we enter the final act, you're going to realize that 1939 isn't just a date in a book. It's a warning for the person watching this screen right now. The year is 1933. If you were living in Berlin, London, or New York, you could feel a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. The long war was waking up. For 15 years the monster had been sleeping, fed by the anger of the treaty and the hunger of the depression. But now the monster was standing up. This is the moment where the mistakes of the past finally turned into the nightmares of the future. In the early 1930s, there was still a tiny bit of hope. World leaders were still meeting in fancy hotels, trying to talk about disarmament. That's a big word for a simple idea. Everyone should throw away their big guns so no one can start a fight. But think about the psychology we've discussed. If you are Germany and you are surrounded by countries that have massive armies while you are forbidden from having even a small one, do you feel safe? You feel like a target. And if you are France, and you remember the millions of your sons who died in 1914, do you want to throw away your guns? Absolutely not. The disarmament conferences were a disaster. Germany walked out. They didn't just walk out of the meeting, they walked out of the entire world community. Hitler, who had just taken power, told his people, "The world wants you to be victims, they want you to be weak. I will make you a fortress." This was the first snap in the line. When a country stops talking, it starts loading. From 1933 onward, the Long War was no longer a secret. Germany began to rebuild its army in total secrecy. They built tractors that were actually tanks. They built mail planes that were actually bombers. They were preparing for the second act of the play, while the rest of the world was still trying to read the script from the first act. Now we get to 1936. This is one of the most important years in human history. If you could go back in a time machine and stop World War II, this is the year you would go to. According to the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was never allowed to put soldiers in a place called the Rhineland. This was a strip of land on the border of France. It was a buffer zone. It was there to make sure France felt safe. Hitler decided to gamble. He sent a small group of soldiers into the Rhineland. They didn't go in with heavy tanks. They went in on bicycles and horses. Hitler actually told his generals, if the French army shows up, turn around and run away immediately. He knew he wasn't strong enough to fight yet. But here is the tragedy. France had the largest army in Europe. They could have stopped the Long War right then and there. They could have arrested those soldiers and ended the Nazi regime before it even started. But they didn't. Why? Because they were haunted by the ghosts of WWI. The French government was paralyzed. They didn't want to start a new war over a border dispute. They let Hitler stay. This was a massive shot of adrenaline for the Nazis. It proved to Hitler that the winners of the First War were too tired to defend their own rules. The relapse was gaining speed. While the world was watching Germany, a miniature world war broke out in Spain. The Spanish Civil War 1936 to 1939 was like a laboratory for the next big conflict. Hitler and Mussolini sent their new planes and tanks to help the Spanish rebels. They wanted to test their equipment. They wanted to see if their blitzkrieg, lightning war ideas actually worked. On the other side, the Soviet Union sent help to the Spanish government. For 3 years, the world watched as Spanish cities were bombed from the sky. This was the first time in history that regular people, mothers, children, shopkeepers, were targeted by airplanes. It was a terrifying preview of what was coming for the rest of Europe. But even after seeing this, the leaders of Britain and France did nothing. They signed non-intervention papers. They closed their eyes and hoped the fire stayed in Spain. But fires don't stay in one room. They spread. By 1938, Hitler was ready for more. He looked at Austria. Remember what we said about broken maps? Austria was a German-speaking country that had been part of a giant empire before WWI. After the war, it was left small and weak. Hitler didn't even have to fight. He just marched in. He called it the Anschluss, the joining. Many people in Austria welcomed him because they were still suffering from the same economic pain as Germany. They wanted to be part of a big, strong nation again. The Treaty of Versailles specifically said Germany and Austria could never join together. Hitler broke that rule in broad daylight, and once again, the world did nothing. The Long War was reclaiming its territory, piece by piece. Now we come to the most famous mistake of all. After taking Austria, Hitler looked at Czechoslovakia, specifically a place called the Sudetenland. Remember our puzzle piece analogy. The Sudetenland was a part of Czechoslovakia, where millions of Germans lived. Hitler used the same excuse he always used. Our people are being treated badly. We must go save them. This time Britain and France got worried. Czechoslovakia had a real army. They had mountains and forts. It looked like a war might finally start. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, flew to Germany to talk to Hitler. This was the Munich Agreement. Chamberlain was a man who truly hated war. He wanted to be a peacemaker. He looked Hitler in the eye and believed him when Hitler said, "This is my last request. I don't want any more land after this." Britain and France told the Czechs, "Give Hitler what he wants, or you are on your own." They literally gave away another country's land to avoid a fight. Chamberlain flew back to London, waving a piece of paper and shouting, "I have brought peace for our time." 6 months later, Hitler broke his promise and took the rest of Czechoslovakia. There was no more peace. There was only the realization that a piece of paper cannot stop a man who wants to burn the world. As 1939 began, there was one last piece of the puzzle. If Hitler was going to start the long war again, he had to make sure he didn't have to fight everyone at once. In WWI, Germany had to fight France in the west and Russia in the east at the same time. This is called a two-front war, and it is almost impossible to win. Hitler didn't want to repeat that mistake, so he did the unthinkable. He made a deal with his greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. These two men hated each other. Their ideas were total opposites, but they made a secret agreement to split Poland in half. The world was shocked. It was like a wolf and a bear agreeing to hunt together. With Russia out of the way, Hitler knew he could finally pull the trigger. At 4:45 a.m., the first shots were fired. German tanks rolled into Poland. This wasn't the end of peace. It was the end of the 20-year break. The long war was back in the light. All the things we've talked about came together in that moment. The soldiers in the tanks were the sons of the men from WWI. The tanks were built with the money saved by ignoring the treaty. The excuse for the invasion was the unfair map drawn in 1919. The lack of resistance was caused by the trauma of the First War. It was a perfect, tragic circle. The world had spent 20 years trying to avoid a war, and in doing so, they had made the war bigger, faster, and more terrible than anything anyone had ever imagined. Why did it happen? Was it just because one man was evil? No. It happened because the world forgot that peace isn't just the absence of fighting. Peace is the presence of justice. If you leave people hungry, they will follow a tyrant. If you draw maps that ignore people's feelings, they will fight to change them. If you make rules but are too scared to enforce them, bullies will break them. The inevitable relapse of 1939 wasn't a surprise to anyone who was really paying attention. It was the natural result of the incomplete peace of 1919. The world had tried to stop a fire by throwing a blanket over it, but they never put out the embers. And in the dark, those embers grew back into a forest fire. As we look at the ruins of Poland in 1939, we have to realize that this was the moment the 20th century truly broke. The two wars were not separate. They were the same earthquake, with a 20-year aftershock that was louder than the original blast. We are standing at the end of a long, dark road. From the muddy trenches of 1914 to the burning cities of 1945, the story of the world wars is really just one single story. It is a story about what happens when the world breaks and nobody knows how to fix it. We have seen how a single piece of paper at Versailles acted like a slow-acting poison. We have seen how money became a weapon. We have seen how the winners of the First War were so broken by their victory that they couldn't prevent a second disaster. But now we need to step back. We need to look at the big picture. Was it avoidable? Or was the human race simply caught in a machine that it didn't know how to stop? If there is one thing I want you to take away from this journey, it is this: World War I and World War II were not two different wars. They were two acts of the same tragedy. Imagine a play where the actors go backstage for a 20-minute intermission. They change their clothes, they get new props, and some of the characters get older. But when the curtain rises for Act 2, the story is exactly where it left off. In 1918, the world stopped shooting, but they never stopped hating. They never solved the problems that started the fight in the first place. They just ran out of bullets and young men. The 20 years of peace was really just a period of recovery. It was a time to build more bullets and grow more young men. Think about the maps we looked at. The men in the Gold Palace at Versailles thought they could solve the world's problems by drawing lines on a piece of paper, but you cannot draw a line through a person's heart. You cannot tell someone they are no longer German or no longer Russian just because a politician in France said so. The broken maps of 1919 created what we call geopolitical debt. This is a debt that isn't paid in money, it is paid in blood. When you create a country that doesn't make sense, or when you leave a people feeling like they have been cheated, you are creating a debt that will eventually have to be settled. In 1939, the ghosts of the past showed up to collect that debt. At the beginning, I promised to show you 3 warning signs from 1919 that are appearing in our world today. This is the moment where history stops being a story about the past and starts being a map for our future. Listen closely, because these are the patterns that lead to catastrophe. In the 1920s, the League of Nations failed because countries stopped believing in international rules. They started looking out only for themselves. They tore up treaties whenever they became inconvenient. Look at the news today. Are we seeing international organizations getting weaker? Are we seeing countries walk away from agreements? When the global police lose their power, the bullies start to look at their neighbor's land. Just like the Rhineland in 1936, it starts small. But if no one stops the first step, the second step is always bigger. We saw how the Great Depression turned regular people into radicals. We saw how hunger made the strong man's promises sound like music. Today we live in a world where the gap between the rich and the poor is growing wider every day. We see massive inflation and people struggling to buy groceries. Just like in 1929, when people feel like the system is failing them, they stop caring about democracy. They start looking for anyone who promises to smash the system. Whether that person is a hero or a monster doesn't matter to someone who can't feed their family. Desperation is the fuel of dictators. It was true in 1933, and it is true now. Hitler's most powerful tool was telling people, "You belong to us, no matter where you live." He used ethnic identity to justify crossing borders. He said that if you speak your language, you should be part of the empire, no matter whose flag is flying over your house. We are seeing this blood and soil logic returning to global politics. We see leaders today claiming land based on ancient history or shared language. When countries start defining their borders by who people are, rather than where the lines are, the map of the world starts to melt. And when the map melts, the wars begin. So here is the final verdict. The long war of 1914 to 1945 taught us that you cannot have peace without justice. You cannot punish a nation into being a good neighbor. You cannot ignore a bully and hope he goes away. And most importantly, you cannot build a stable world on a foundation of lies and debt. The biggest question I have for you is this: is the period of time we are living in right now, the years since 1945, actually a long peace, or are we just in another much longer interwar period? For decades we have avoided a third world war. We have built better organizations, we have more trade, and we have weapons so scary that no one wants to use them. But the ghosts of Versailles are still there. The anger over maps, the fear of economic collapse, and the rise of the strong man are all back on the stage. History is not a straight line. It is a circle. We like to think we are smarter than the people in 1919. We like to think we would have stopped the march into the Rhineland. We like to think we would have fixed the economy before it broke. But the people in 1919 were just like us. They were tired. They wanted to be happy. They wanted to forget the horrors of the war. Their mistake wasn't that they were evil. Their mistake was that they were tired. They chose the easy path instead of the right path. They chose to ignore the problems until the problems became too big to solve. Don't just remember the dates and the names. Remember the feeling. Remember the ticking clock. Because history only repeats itself when we stop listening to its warnings. The Great War set the stage for WWI, but we are the ones who decide if the stage is set for a third act. The ink is in your hands. The map is on your table. What kind of world are you going to draw? Stay curious, stay skeptical, and most importantly, stay awake. Because the long war only wins when we fall asleep.